Hi, I'm back. We're ready for chapter 12 of the Infinity Ring, book 4, Curse of the Ancients. And we're on chapter 12, 1,000 years later. Sarah opened her eyes, shaking uncontrollably. Her body no longer felt real now, and she'd broken through her repressive memory of the cataclysm. She felt fake, made up. Though she was clearly sitting on the clay dirt behind a massive building, it felt like she was floating, up into the sky, into nothingness. Everyone was going to die, including the parents she'd always dreamt about. They would die trying to fight their way back to her. She'd find them in her uncle's barn. Her remnants would forever take an entirely different meaning. Sarah turned and saw Dak and Rick looking around, taking in their new environment, which wasn't new so much as updated. They landed in the exact same space they landed in the last time they warped, Mayan country. Ismail, on the large patch of thick, tall grass, except where the fallen observatory rubble once lay, a beautiful new observatory, twice the size of its predecessor, now stood. Ithic had done exactly what he had promised, and the temple where Sarah had just watched Pascal paint a sepia tree into the codex had been transformed into a massive church. Judging by the sun, it was late afternoon. The people walking the raised white road in the distance were a combination of traditional Mayans and white men dressed in pious robes. Sarah knew right away that they were the Franciscan monks she had read about, the ones who settled in Mayan villages and tried to convert the indigenous people to their own religious beliefs. "I'm not saying anything this time," Dak suddenly announced. Sarah found Dak staring at her. Poor Dak. Her best friend had no idea what she'd found in her Uncle Diego's barn. "Nope," Dak said, shaking his head. "I refuse to even bring up the fact that tears are literally streaming down your face. My lips are sealed." Sarah couldn't bring herself to tell him about his parents. It was too awful, and it was way off into the future. At the same time, Dak was so worried about his parents being lost in time. Wouldn't he want to know where they made their way back? Sarah stared at Dak, trying to decide if it was better to know the unbearable truth or live as long as possible in happy ignorance. "Know why I'm keeping quiet?" Dak said. "Because it's none of my business who I am to point out that you're shaking like a hairless dog in the snow." "It's just the warp again," Sarah managed to say. Dak held up his hand, saying, No need to even discuss it, Sarah. I'm steering clear of your hysterics from now on." He turned to Rick and said, "I see Loverboy over here has the same strategy." Rick didn't even look up. "Wow," Dak said, turning back to Sarah. "What's wrong with you people? Last time I checked, I was the one who nearly got decapitated by a falling wall." Sarah tried to think up something lighthearted to say back to at least pretend things were normal, but her mind drew a blank. Every time she looked at Dak, she remembered turning over the bodies of her dead parents, and that made her remember the faces of her own dead parents too, and her uncle Diego. Sarah pulled the S-square out of Rick's satchel, shaking his head. He turned on the power. "Somebody has a sense of humor." "Hey, Gabby." "Somebody has lost their sense of humor," he said, typing something in the keyboard. "What are we doing isn't easy. I understand that, but we have to keep our composure, right? I mean, we have a fairly important job to do." He looked up at Sarah. "We have to save the world." Sarah wiped her tear-stained face on the arm of her hipil, I don't know, which is part of what she's wearing, I guess, and said, "I'm pretty sure we're all aware of that, Dak. Just cut us some slack. Dak motioned toward Rick with his thumb and said, I saw what happened to Rick Stir over there. His girlfriend or whatever tried to give him a parting gift, a locket or something, but he dropped it. Isn't that right, Rick? Sarah watched Rick turn to Dak, scowling. Dak was oblivious, of course. See, that's why I tell all my bros back home to steer clear of the lovey-dovey stuff. It's asking for trouble, dude. You want my advice? If you absolutely have to interact with the opposite sex, make sure it's with a girl you can treat like one of the guys. Like Sarah. He kicked at her with one of his feet. Wow, said Sarah. That's so sweet of you. Sarah might have slugged Dak in the ribs if she hadn't just remembered finding his dead and bloated parents during the cataclysm. Rick stood up suddenly. Without saying a word, he walked away. Hey, Dak called after him. You can't leave. It's going to be dark soon, and we're supposed to stick together. Rick didn't even turn around. Rick, Sarah shouted, but he had already rounded the corner of to the new observatory out of sight. She turned to Dak. You happy now? Was it something I said? Sarah rolled her eyes. When is it not something you say? I was just offering the guy a little romantic guidance. Dak shook his head. Some people are too sensitive. We should go after him, Sarah said. She stood up and looked around to try to get her bearings. It was odd seeing all the things that had changed, the updated huts, the new trees and paved roads. But at the same time, everything felt so familiar. Fine, Dak said. But first, let's look at the latest riddle I just pulled up. Dak turned to the S square around so Sarah could read the screen. To save the reputation of the treasure's truth, do the following. Seek the help of those who follow the most important thing in the world. Then dig deep, deeper, deepest, unlocking the long locked door. It will take a polyglot to understand the wisdom of the glyphs and the forging of the curse. Sarah read it twice, and then she stood back up, shaking her head. I don't get it. Neither do I. She wasn't surprised that the difficulty of the riddles were increasing. She knew the historians hadn't had time to completely program the S square. Things were more vague now. The further they got into the breaks, the less information they would have. What the heck is the most important thing in the world? Said Dak. Sarah shook her head. No idea. It seems like an extension of the first riddle, though, Dak said. Both talk about truth and treasure and curse. The treasure is the codex, Sarah said. We know that much. And the curse is about the cataclysm described in the Great Mayan Codex. Sarah just looked at Dak for a few long seconds. According to Pascal, there was never any mention of a cataclysm in his codex. None? Sarah shook her head, trying not to think about what she knew about the cataclysm. And what does the riddle mean about a reproduction? Dak asked. I still wonder if we should have just taken Pascal's codex with us. Sarah was having trouble concentrating now. She stared at the words, unlocking the long locked door. And all of a sudden, she felt herself remembering the cataclysm again, her flooded barn, the bodies she had turned over. A polyglot has something to do with language, right, Dak? Right, Dak said. I'm not sure, Sarah said, but I know someone who would. We really need to go find Rick. We should all be doing this together. And that means you might have to go easy on him for a little while. I guess you're right, Dak said, standing up. He looked at Sarah. You know, I really do see him drop a piece of jewelry that snake girl had just given him. Sarah had seen the way Rick looked at Kaisa and couldn't have been easy for him to say goodbye. You missed a few things while you were recovering in the cave, she said. I figured as much. They started walking around the corner of the observatory in the direction they saw Rick go. As soon as they rounded the corner, Sarah nearly ran right into a teenage boy. It wasn't Rick, though. It was a Mayan boy who had a large bag slung over his left shoulder. He wore an outfit similar to Dak's. "Sorry," he said. "It's okay," she said, her translating device kicking in to match his dialect. He straightened his bag and said, "Well, have a nice evening." He started to leave, but then turned around and looked over Sarah and Dak for a few seconds, noting their attire before saying, "A bunch of us are meeting in the cave in a little while if you're interested in practicing the old ways." "Maybe we'll join you," said Dak. Sarah and Dak watched the boy hurry along the path that Sarah remembered led out of the village and up toward the cave. Dak poked at her shoulder and said, "A bunch of Mayans racing off to the cave? Isn't this exactly how things started last time?" "It is," Sarah said, but she had a sneaking suspicion that the cave served a much different function in 1562. Okay, that's the end of chapter 12. The next chapter, this is who we are. I don't know when you're watching this, but here tomorrow is Mother's Day. I have on my Mama Bear sweatshirt that I got for Mother's Day. Tell your mother how much you love her. Tell her how much you thank her for doing everything she does. Even if you watch this after Mother's Day, every day can be Mother's Day. We need to love people and tell them we love them as much as we can while they're here. Thanks so much, and we'll look forward to the next chapter. Bye.